Redditor 1. I still remember that evening like it was yesterday, though it's been 20 years since the incident. The memory comes back to me in fragments. The way the bay reflected the setting sun, the comfortable weight of my friend Sarah's shoulder against mine as we sprawled on my parents' old plaid couch, the exact moment when everything changed. We were 14, more interested in gossip and homework than the darkening sky outside. The bay view from our living room windows usually meant postcard-perfect sunsets, but that night, something else caught our attention. At first, it was just a hint of color, an odd purplish-pink glow that seemed to rise from behind the tree line across the water. "What's that?" Sarah asked, sitting up straight. I felt my stomach clench. My sister Amy's voice echoed in my head, recounting countless alien abduction stories she'd collected like trading cards. I'd always brushed them off, but now... The lights grew closer, and with them came a silence that felt wrong. The usual symphony of evening sounds, distant traffic, birds settling in for the night, the neighbors' wind chimes, all fell away like someone had hit a cosmic mute button. Sarah's hand found mine, her palm clammy against my skin. "Mom," I called out, my voice cracking. "Mom, you need to see this." My mother appeared in the doorway, probably expecting teenage drama. Instead, she froze, her face draining of color as she watched the massive object drift toward our house with deliberate slowness. It was rectangular, easily half the size of a football field, its metallic surface catching and reflecting the last rays of sunlight. The windows, if you could call them that, were arranged in a pattern I couldn't quite make sense of, dark against the steel-like exterior. "This isn't happening," my mother whispered, but her trembling hands were already reaching for the phone. I heard her voice shake as she dialed 911, trying to sound calm as she reported what we were all seeing. "Yes, I need to report. I know this sounds crazy, but there's an object. Yes, we're at 1247 Bayview Drive. No, I'm completely sober. It's right above my house right now." The silence seemed to deepen as the craft hovered directly overhead. The usual rush-hour traffic on Bay Road had disappeared, or maybe it was still there and we just couldn't hear it anymore. The air felt thick, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Sarah pressed closer to me, and I could feel her whole body trembling. What strikes me most about that moment, looking back, was the absolute wrongness of the silence. No hum of engines, no whoosh of displaced air, nothing to indicate that this massive object was capable of flight. It defied everything I knew about physics, about reality itself. The windows seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating perfect rectangular voids in the metallic surface. Time became meaningless. It could have been minutes or hours that we stood there, three humans frozen in their own living room, staring up through the windows at something that shouldn't exist. My mother was still on the phone, her words becoming more desperate as she tried to convince the 911 operator that this wasn't a prank, wasn't a misidentified airplane or helicopter. Then, without warning, the craft began to move again. It accelerated so smoothly it seemed to glide through the air, heading toward the town center. As it moved away, sound rushed back into the world like a breaking wave. Cars honking, dogs barking, the neighbor's TV bleeding through the walls. The sudden return to normalcy was almost as shocking as the silence had been. My mother hung up the phone, her hands still shaking. They said there are other reports coming in. Later that night, we watched the local news with a kind of desperate hope for validation. The anchor's voice was carefully neutral as she reported on multiple UFO sightings in the area, quickly followed by an official explanation: space debris burning up in the atmosphere. I felt my heart sink. Space debris doesn't hover silently over houses. Space debris doesn't have windows. The years since have brought all the usual skepticism. People nod politely when I tell the story, their eyes glazing over with that, "Sure, whatever you say, look, I've come to hate." Sometimes I call my mom or Sarah just to hear them confirm that yes, it happened. We weren't crazy, we saw what we saw. But here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. The detail I usually leave out of the story: one of those dark windows wasn't entirely dark. As the craft passed overhead, I saw something move behind the glass. something that was watching us just as intently as we were watching it. Something with eyes that reflected that same purplish-pink light that first caught our attention. I've tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a product of my terrified teenage imagination, but sometimes on quiet nights when I'm alone, I find myself looking up at the sky, not out of fear exactly, but with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, because I know they're still out there, those silent watchers in their impossible craft. And sometimes, when the silence falls just right and the light hits the clouds with that particular purplish-pink glow, I wonder if they remember us too. These days, I keep a camera by my bedroom window, just in case, because next time, and somewhere deep down, I know there will be a next time, I want more than just memories and the scattered testimonies of those who were there. I want proof. Though sometimes, in my darker moments, I wonder if proof would make any difference. After all, what's more believable, that 3 people shared a mass hallucination on a quiet evening by the bay, or that something beyond our understanding chose my ordinary suburban home for a moment of extraordinary contact? The official explanation never changed. Space debris, they said, just space debris catching the light in an unusual way. But space debris doesn't move like that, doesn't watch you through dark windows, doesn't leave you with the bone-deep certainty that everything you thought you knew about the universe is wrong. Sarah moved away years ago, but she still calls me sometimes, usually late at night. "Do you ever think about it?" she'll ask, and I know exactly what she means. We don't need to specify anymore. That evening changed us both in ways we're still trying to understand. My mom doesn't talk about it much these days, but I've caught her scanning the sky sometimes, her eyes drawn to any unusual light or movement. As for me, I've learned to live with the knowledge that we're not alone, that something vast and silent and impossibly advanced took an interest in our little corner of the world that evening. But I've also learned that some experiences can't be shared, can't be truly understood by anyone who wasn't there. So I keep watching the sky, keeping my story close, and wondering if somewhere out there, in some alien record of Earth encounters, there's a note about 3 humans in a house by the bay, looking up with wonder and terror at something their world told them couldn't possibly exist. Redditor 2. The crunch of frozen grass beneath our feet was the only sound breaking through the pre-dawn silence as Mike and I made our way back to his place. It was 3 a.m., and the winter darkness pressed in around us like a living thing, held at bay only by the weak orange glow of scattered streetlights. We'd spent the evening watching horror documentaries and trading theories about UFO sightings, the kind of conversation that makes you hyper-aware of every shadow. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, but that wasn't the only reason for my shivering. We'd just finished discussing the Phoenix Lights incident, and Mike had shared a story about his uncle, who claimed to have been followed home by strange lights one night in the 90s. "I'm telling you, man," Mike was saying, his words floating away in cloudy breaths. "There's no way we're alone in the universe. The government knows way more than they're telling us." I nodded, watching our shadows stretch and contract as we passed under each streetlight. The neighborhoods here were old, with houses set far back from the road and mature trees creating dark tunnels between the lights. Perfect settings for horror stories, I thought, then immediately wished I hadn't. "Did you hear that?" Mike stopped suddenly, grabbing my arm. I was about to tell him to knock it off. We'd been spooking ourselves all night, and I wasn't in the mood for more, when I heard it too. A sound that didn't belong in the quiet suburban night. Something electronic and alien. It reminded me of the startup noise from my old PlayStation, but distorted and impossibly loud, as if played through massive speakers. We both looked up instinctively, and that's when I saw it. The sight branded itself into my memory with such clarity that I can still recall every detail years later. Hovering maybe 200 feet above us was a massive triangular object, darker than the night sky around it. It was like a piece of the stars had been cut away, leaving a geometric void. Each corner pulsed with a light that seemed to bend the air around it, not the harsh beam of a spotlight or the steady glow of an aircraft warning light, but something that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. "Damn. Holy shit," Mike whispered beside me. Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. The craft, if that's what it was, moved in a way that defied physics. It would drift in one direction, stop abruptly with no deceleration, then slide sideways as smooth as mercury. No human aircraft could move like that. The air around us felt charged, like just before a lightning strike, and I could taste metal on my tongue. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely get it out of my pocket. By the time I managed to unlock it and open the camera, the triangle had shifted position again, now directly overhead. The lights at each corner had intensified, and I could feel a vibration in my chest, like standing too close to a massive speaker. "Are you getting this?" Mike's voice cracked. Neither of us had moved a step since looking up. Before I could answer, the thing released another burst of that electronic sound, but this time it felt like it was inside my head, reverberating through my skull. My phone screen went black, then flickered back to life, but the camera app wouldn't open. An error message kept flashing. Device temperature too high. Then it moved. 1 second it was above us, and the next, gone. The acceleration was impossible. It shot away faster than anything I'd ever seen, leaving a visible distortion in the air like heat waves over hot asphalt. The sound it made as it vanished was like a sci-fi spaceship sound effect cranked up to 11, a sort of VWOOGH that set off car alarms all down the street. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the now empty sky. My ears were ringing, and I could still see after images of those lights when I blinked. The night felt different now, like reality had stretched and hadn't quite snapped back into place. "We need to report this," Mike finally said, his voice unsteady. "The police or someone." I nodded, but we both knew we wouldn't. Who would believe us? Two guys walking home late at night after spending hours watching paranormal documentaries? We'd sound like lunatics or attention seekers. Besides, something told me this wasn't the kind of thing local law enforcement would be equipped to handle. We started walking again, faster now, both of us stealing glances at the sky every few seconds. My phone had cooled down but was acting strange. The screen would occasionally flicker, and apps would close randomly. Mike checked his phone too. It wouldn't turn on at all. "You know what's really freaking me out?" Mike said as we turned onto his street. "We were just talking about this stuff. Like, literally minutes before it happened. What are the odds?" I'd been thinking the same thing. Had our conversation somehow summoned it? Or had it been watching us, listening, waiting for the right moment? The implications made my skin crawl. When we reached Mike's house, neither of us wanted to be alone. We ended up sitting in his kitchen until sunrise, jumping at every sound, trying to process what we'd seen. We made a pact to write down everything we could remember while it was fresh in our minds. Mike's account matched mine exactly. The shape, the lights, the impossible movement, the electronic scream. The next day, local Facebook groups were buzzing with posts about the strange sounds and lights. But no one else reported seeing the triangle directly. The local paper ran a small story about a series of unexplained disturbances, attributing the car alarms to a minor earthquake that seismologists couldn't confirm. In the weeks that followed, strange things kept happening. Both our phones had to be replaced. They never worked quite right after that night. We'd occasionally hear that same electronic tone in the distance, but fainter, like an echo. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of triangular shadows passing over the moon, but they were always gone before we could be sure of what we'd seen. The worst part was the dreams. They started about a week after the incident, vivid nightmares of being watched from above by something vast and incomprehensible. In the dreams, those corner lights would pulse in patterns that felt like language, like they were trying to tell us something. We'd wake up with nosebleeds and splitting headaches, the taste of metal strong in our mouths. Mike moved away a few months later. He said it was for a job opportunity, but I knew the real reason. Every time he stepped outside at night, his eyes would dart to the sky, searching for that dark triangle. I understood. I did the same thing. I still live in the same neighborhood, but I don't walk at night anymore. Sometimes, on particularly clear evenings, I'll sit in my backyard and look up at the stars. They don't seem as distant or innocent as they used to. I know something's up there, something that defies our understanding of what's possible, something that might have been studying us, just as intently as we'd been discussing them that night. The incident changed how I see the world. Every unexplained sound makes me freeze. Every flickering light draws my eye. Every plane passing overhead gets a second, more careful look. Because now I know, we all know, deep down, that we're not alone. And whatever's out there, whatever was piloting that triangle, it knows we know. Last week, I heard that startup sound again, faint but unmistakable. I didn't look up this time. Instead, I hurried inside, locked the doors, and drew the blinds. But even through the closed windows, I could have sworn I heard something else. A pattern of electronic tones that sounded almost like words. We'll be back. Redditor 3. I've carried this memory for 15 years now, turning it over and over in my mind like a smooth river stone, wondering if the edges have worn away with time. The details remain sharp, though. Too sharp for just a dream, as Mark keeps insisting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a Tuesday in late September when it happened. I remember because I'd just started my new job at the accounting firm, and I'd been obsessing over a spreadsheet error all evening. The kind of mundane detail that shouldn't stick in your mind, but does. I'd finally fallen asleep around midnight, my laptop still charging on the nightstand, casting a thin blue glow across my bedroom ceiling. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the normal midnight quiet of my apartment with its familiar symphony of humming refrigerator and distant traffic. This was different. A complete absence of sound, as if someone had pressed mute on the world. Even the constant ringing in my ears, a souvenir from too many loud concerts in college, had vanished. I felt weightless, disconnected. You know that feeling just before you fall asleep when your body feels like it's floating? It was like that, but more intense, more real. I wasn't in my bed anymore, I knew that much, but I couldn't feel the typical sensations of movement. No rush of air, no sense of up or down, just the room materialized around me gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse. First the curved walls, their surface seeming to shift between deep purple and midnight blue, depending on where I looked. Then the light, soft, diffused, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of being underwater at twilight, that ethereal quality of light filtering through waves. But it was the decorations that struck me as truly alien. Not in a Hollywood sci-fi way, with blinking lights and chrome surfaces. These were organic, almost alive, patterns that seemed to breathe, shifting and flowing like oil on water, colors I'm not sure I could name, existing somewhere between the familiar spectrum of my human experience. Beautiful, but in a way that made my brain itch, like trying to read a word that's just slightly out of focus. I should have been terrified. That's what keeps nagging at me, even now. Any rational person would have been screaming, fighting, trying to wake themselves up. But I felt calm, detached, as if I were watching everything happen to someone else. Maybe that was their doing, or maybe it was just shock. I'll never know for sure. The pregnancy, if that's what it was, didn't announce itself with any physical sensation. It was more like suddenly remembering something you'd forgotten, a fact sliding into place in your mind. Oh, of course, I'm carrying a child now. As simple and matter-of-fact as knowing your own name. The tank appeared to my right, and even in that strange dreamlike state, I remember thinking how absurd it was that my first thought was Diet Coke. The liquid inside was that exact caramel color, but it moved wrong, swirling with purpose rather than random currents. I watched, fascinated, as something, energy? Consciousness? Passed from my body into the tank. No pain, no sensation at all, just a certainty that something profound had been transferred. Time became fluid then. I watched the development process like a time-lapse video, but I could focus on any moment, slow it down, study the details. Cells dividing, structures forming, a heart beginning to beat. It was beautiful and terrifying and impossible, all at once. The fetus looked human, perfectly, ordinarily human. That detail haunts me more than anything else. No alien features, no obvious signs of hybridization, just a baby, growing in a tank of what looked like soda. The ringing of my phone cut through it all like a knife through spider silk. I jerked awake, tangled in my sheets, my heart pounding as if I'd been running. The blue glow of my laptop was still there, familiar and grounding. My phone displayed Emily's name, the screen painfully bright in the darkness. "You okay?" she asked when I answered. "You weren't answering my texts, and I got worried." I told her everything, the words spilling out in a confused rush. The teleportation, the room, the tank, the baby. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "How do you know it was just a dream?" I laughed it off at the time, made some joke about needing to lay off the late-night true crime documentaries. But her words stuck with me, burrowing into my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. The relief of not being pregnant was immediate and overwhelming. I took 3 tests that week, just to be sure. All negative. Life went on. I buried myself in work, started dating again, tried to file the whole experience away under weird dreams and move on. Then, 5 years later, I made the mistake of telling Mark about it at a party. He'd had a few beers and was going on about his latest UFO podcast, Obsession. I thought he'd appreciate the story, maybe laugh about how our brains can create such vivid scenarios. Instead, he got eerily quiet, his face pale despite the flush of alcohol. "Do you know how many abduction stories match what you just described?" he asked. "The circular room, the calm feeling, the reproductive experiments. It's like reading from a script." He spent the next hour pulling up articles on his phone, showing me account after account that paralleled my experience. The same descriptions of the room, the same sense of detachment, the same focus on pregnancy and fetal development. Some details varied, but the core elements were consistent enough to make my skin crawl. I left the party early that night, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, staring at my ceiling, remembering the strange, shifting colors of that other room. The more I thought about it, the more details surfaced, things I hadn't told Emily or Mark. The faint smell of ozone in the air, the way the patterns on the walls seemed to respond to my thoughts, the absolute certainty I felt about everything that was happening, even as it defied explanation. I still don't believe I was abducted by aliens. I tell myself it was just a dream, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch myself touching my abdomen, wondering about that baby in the tank, wondering if somewhere out there, in some impossible nursery beyond the stars, a child with my DNA is growing up among beings who paint with colors we can't name. The rational part of my mind knows how ridiculous that sounds. But another part, the part that remembers the weight of certainty I felt in that room, whispers that maybe the truth is more complex than our simple binary of real and unreal. Maybe there are spaces between dreaming and waking, between imagination and memory, where other realities can bleed through. I don't have answers. I probably never will. But I know this. Every time I open a can of Diet Coke, I find myself studying the liquid inside, half expecting to see something growing in its depths. And every time my phone rings in the middle of the night, there's a moment, just a fraction of a second, where I'm back in that room, watching impossible things unfold in the silence between stars. Redditor 4. I never used to believe in UFOs. Sure, I enjoyed the occasional sci-fi movie, but I always considered myself too practical for that sort of thing. Aliens visiting Earth? Please. That was before that evening in October changed everything. I remember it was unseasonably warm that day, the kind of evening where you could still wear short sleeves even as the sun started its slow descent behind the city skyline. My third-floor apartment wasn't much, but the balcony made up for it. It was my little sanctuary, especially during my evening cigarette breaks. The clock had just struck 7:15 p.m. when I stepped out, marble light in hand. Below, the city was alive with its usual rhythm, people heading home from work, couples walking hand in hand, the occasional honk of an impatient driver. I liked watching them all from up here, feeling both part of the city and somehow removed from it. I had just lit my cigarette when I saw it. At first I thought it was a helicopter. That would have made sense. We got them sometimes, usually news choppers or medical transport to the hospital a few blocks away. But this was different. It moved wrong. Too smooth. Too quiet. The object followed the street's path perfectly, as if invisible tracks guided it. It couldn't have been more than 100 feet up, low enough that I had to crane my neck only slightly to watch it glide by. No sound, no lights, just a dark, oval shape against the dimming sky. "Hey!" A voice from below snapped my attention downward. A young couple stood on the sidewalk, both pointing upward. The girl's phone was out, aimed at the sky. "Are you seeing this too?" "Yeah," I called back, my cigarette forgotten between my fingers. "What is that thing?" "We've been following it for like 5 minutes," the guy shouted up. His voice had that edge to it, the kind you get when you're excited and scared at the same time. "It came from downtown, just floating." I watched as it continued its eerily steady path down the street. Something about its movement made my skin crawl. It was too precise, too deliberate, like it was searching for something. Or someone. That's when my cigarette burned my fingers. I cursed, dropping it onto the balcony floor. As I stamped it out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The street had gone quiet. No cars, no pedestrians. Even the couple below had vanished. I gripped the railing, leaning over to look for them. They couldn't have gone far in just those few seconds, but the sidewalk was empty in both directions. The only movement was their abandoned phones, lying face up on the concrete. My heart began to pound. I wanted to go inside, lock the door, pull the curtains shut, but I couldn't move, because the object had stopped. It hung there, maybe 2 blocks down, completely motionless. And then, slowly, it began to turn. The motion was so gradual that at first I wasn't sure it was happening, but there was no mistaking it. The thing was rotating, and it was facing my direction. I've never felt more exposed than I did in that moment. Standing there on my balcony, illuminated by the dying sunlight, I felt like a specimen under a microscope. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. My ears popped as if the pressure had suddenly changed. That's when I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No traffic, no distant sirens, no air conditioning units humming. Even the birds had gone quiet. It was as if someone had pressed mute on the entire world. And then I saw them. Or rather, I saw where they weren't. Dark shapes, roughly human-sized, moving along the street below. Except they weren't really shapes at all. They were more like holes in reality, places where the world seemed to bend and distort. 3 of them, moving with an unnatural grace, heading straight for where the couple had been standing. I wanted to scream, to warn someone, but my voice wouldn't work. My body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as these things gathered around the dropped phones. One of them reached down. I saw its non-hand phase through the device, and the phone screen flickered wildly before going dark. The oval craft began to move again, this time descending slowly. It stopped about 20 feet above the street, directly over the reality-bending figures. No sound, no lights, just that impenetrable darkness against the sky. That's when I felt it, a pressure in my head, like someone trying to push their way in. Images flashed through my mind, stars I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, faces that weren't faces at all. My nose began to bleed. I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember is sitting on my balcony floor, my back against the wall. The sun had set completely and the streetlights were on. Below, traffic moved normally. People walked by, absorbed in their phones or conversations. Everything was normal, except for the phones. They were still there on the sidewalk, exactly where the couple had dropped them. As I watched, a police officer walked by, noticed them, and picked them up. He looked around, probably for their owners, then shrugged and pocketed them. I stayed out there for hours, chain-smoking through half a pack, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Around midnight, I finally went inside and did what anyone would do. I Googled UFO sightings in my city. My hands shook as I scrolled through report after report from that evening. Dozens of people had seen the craft. Some described it exactly as I had. Others mentioned the silence, the pressure change, the lost time. But none mentioned the dark figures or the missing couple. I checked the local news every day, looking for missing persons reports. So far, nothing. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a familiar silence falling over the city. And when I dare to look out my window, I see those holes in reality, moving along the streets below, searching. I still go out on my balcony to smoke. Old habits die hard, I guess. But now I watch the sky with different eyes. And when the sun starts to set, I make sure I'm safely inside, doors locked, curtains drawn. Because I know they're still out there. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those impossible stars, those geometric patterns, those faces that aren't faces. And I wonder, what did they take from my mind during those missing minutes? What did they leave behind? More importantly, what are they looking for? And what happens when they finally find it? I know one thing for certain now. We are not alone. And maybe we never were. The truth isn't out there, it's right here, walking our streets, watching us through holes in reality. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, it takes people away. So if you're ever out at dusk and the world goes quiet and you feel that pressure in your head, don't look up. Don't try to follow it. Just get inside, lock your doors, and pray they're not looking for you. Because I've seen what happens to the curious ones. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear their phones ringing from the police station's evidence locker, displaying numbers that don't exist, containing messages in languages that have never been spoken on Earth. Redditor 5. I still see that light when I close my eyes. It's been 3 months since that evening, and I've spent countless hours trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But I can't. Not when David saw it too. Not when we both watched that impossible thing move across the sky. And especially not now, when the lights have started appearing in my bedroom. That evening had been perfect. One of those rare September nights when the air feels like silk against your skin, and the sky stretches out above you like an endless ocean of possibilities. David and I had driven out to Blackwood Point, our usual spot for stargazing since high school. It was far enough from the city that the stars actually had a chance to shine, but not so remote that it felt dangerous. At least, that's what we'd always thought. We'd spread out an old blanket on the hood of my Honda Civic, the metal still warm from the day's heat. The sun had just set, leaving that peculiar twilight where the sky can't decide if it wants to be day or night. You could still make out the contrails of passing planes, their white streaks cutting through the deepening blue like chalk lines on a blackboard. I remember checking my phone, 7:43 p.m., and thinking we should probably head back soon, but then I saw it. At first I thought it was Venus, that brilliant evening star that always seems too bright to be real. It hung there, perfectly still, more radiant than anything else in the sky. I found myself staring at it, unable to look away. Something about its intensity felt wrong. Stars shouldn't look that sharp, that focused. They should twinkle, shimmer, dance a little in the atmosphere. This one didn't. It just was. And then it moved. The movement was so deliberate, so controlled, that for a second I thought I was imagining it. But no, that point of light was definitely sliding across the sky, like someone had taken a pushpin of light and was slowly dragging it across the dome of heaven. It wasn't like a shooting star, all flash and speed and gone before you can point it out. This was different. Methodical. Purposeful. I wanted to say something to David, but my throat had gone dry. What do you say when you're watching the impossible happen? How do you put words to something that shouldn't exist? So I just sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching as that light carved its path through the twilight. Yo, David's voice cracked the silence. Did you just see that star start fucking moving? Relief and terror flooded through me in equal measure. Relief because I wasn't crazy, wasn't seeing things. Terror because if David saw it too, then it was real. And if it was real, then everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. Yeah, I managed to croak out. Yeah, I see it. We watched in silence as it continued its journey, that impossible point of light gliding across the sky until it disappeared beyond the horizon. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the empty patch of sky where it had vanished. Finally, David let out a shaky laugh. Must have been a satellite or something, right? Or like the International Space Station. I wanted to agree with him, Wanted to laugh it off and say, yeah, of course, just a satellite. But I'd seen the ISS before. I'd tracked satellites across the night sky. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Maybe, I said, but we both knew I was lying. We didn't stay much longer after that. The magic of the evening had been replaced by something else, something that made the darkness between the stars feel heavy and watching. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. That should have been the end of it. A weird experience, something to tell at parties maybe, but nothing more. Except 3 days later, I started seeing the lights in my bedroom. The first time, I thought it was just headlights from passing cars throwing shadows on my ceiling. But my bedroom faces the backyard. There shouldn't be any car lights reaching it. I lay there, watching as a pinpoint of light exactly like the one we'd seen in the sky slowly traced a path across my ceiling. It moved with that same deliberate pace, that same unsettling purpose. I called David the next morning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Are you seeing them too? I asked, not bothering with hello. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. In my living room, he finally said. Every night around 3 a.m., it just moves across the wall, like it's searching for something. Since then, the lights have become more frequent. They're not just at night anymore. Sometimes I'll be sitting at my desk at work, and I'll catch one sliding across my computer screen, in the bathroom mirror while I'm brushing my teeth, in the windshield of my car while I'm driving. David stopped answering my calls. His roommate told me he moved out 2 weeks ago, didn't leave a forwarding address, just packed up in the middle of the night and disappeared. But before he left, he texted me one last time. They're not just watching anymore. I know what he means. The lights are getting closer. That first night at Blackwood Point, we watched that light move across the vast expanse of sky. Now I sometimes feel them brush against my skin, cold as starlight, sharp as needle points. They leave marks, tiny pinpricks of luminescence that fade after a few hours. Last night, I woke up to find my entire bedroom filled with them. Dozens of points of light, all moving in perfect synchronization, drawing patterns I couldn't quite understand but that made my head hurt to look at. And in the center of it all, hovering just above my bed, was one light brighter than all the others. The same one we'd seen that first night. I'm sure of it. It hung there, watching me with its impossible radiance, and for the first time, I understood what David meant about them not just watching. Because in that moment, as that light hung above me, I felt something reach out. Not physically, there was nothing to see or touch, but I felt it probe at the edges of my mind, like icy fingers trying to pry open a locked door. I haven't slept since then. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what happened, what's still happening. The lights are all around me now, their movements more agitated, more purposeful. They're drawing closer, their patterns more complex, more insistent. I can feel that pressure against my mind growing stronger, and I don't know how much longer I can wait. There's something different about them tonight. They're singing? No, that's not right. It's not sound, not really, but I can feel it, reverberating through my bones, through my thoughts. It's beautiful. God, it's so beautiful. I think I understand now what they want, why they chose us that night. They're not just lights, they're windows, doors, and they're finally opening. I have to go now. They're waiting for me. And somewhere, in the spaces between the stars, I think David is waiting too. If you're reading this, look up at the night sky. Watch the stars carefully, and if you see one that shines just a little too brightly, that moves just a little too purposefully, run. They've already seen you. Redditor 6. I've never told anyone the whole truth about that night in the coastal range. The memory still makes my hands shake when I think about it, especially on nights like this when the fog rolls in thick enough to blur the streetlights into ghostly halos. We were stupid kids, really. Jake and I had this brilliant idea to camp in a clear-cut because the exposed ridge would give us the perfect view of the Perseid meteor shower. The August air was unseasonably cold, and our sleeping bags were already damp from the coastal mist by the time we pitched our tent. Did you hear about the disappearances? Jake had asked as we unrolled our sleeping bags. 3 hikers in the last month. Search and rescue found their gear, but... He'd let the sentence hang there, like the mist between the stumps. I checked my phone, 11:42 p.m., and only 1 bar of service. The meteors were supposed to peak around midnight, but clouds had started rolling in, turning the stars into smudged pinpricks. That's when I saw it, a deep, pulsing red light through the wall of Douglas firs at the edge of the clear-cut. "Jake," I whispered, nudging him. "Look." The light moved with impossible slowness, hovering just above the tree line. No sound, not even a whisper of wind. Just that blood-red glow, steady as a heartbeat, drifting through the night like a lazy ember. "Drone, maybe?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. But we both knew better. Drones had green and white navigation lights, and they didn't move like that, like something testing the air, searching. The light stopped. My throat went dry as I realized it had stopped directly across from our tent. Then it changed direction, toward us. Jake scrambled for the flashlight, but I grabbed his arm. Some deep, primal part of my brain screamed that making any light would be the last mistake we'd ever make. The red glow grew brighter, closer. Through the thin nylon of the tent, I could see it wasn't just red anymore. There was something dark at its core, like a pupil in a bloody eye. My heart hammered so hard I was certain it would give us away. The temperature plummeted. Frost began crackling across our tent fly, spreading in impossible patterns that looked disturbingly like writing in a language I'd never seen. The light stopped just outside our tent. A low hum started, not in my ears, but in my teeth, in my bones. Through the frosted tent wall, I saw something move, a shadow within the light, reaching out with too many joints, too many angles. That's when my phone buzzed. One new message. "Unknown sender. We see you watching. Your kind always watches first. Now it's our turn." I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The red light eventually moved on, but sometimes, on clear nights, I'll catch a reflection in my window, just for a second, and my phone will buzz with 1 bar of service. I never read the messages anymore, but they keep coming, always at 11:42 p.m., always from unknown numbers, and they're getting closer to home. Redditor 7. The blue flash caught me off guard, bright enough to make me slam the brakes. My tires squealed against the empty highway, and for a split second I thought I'd imagined it. The pre-dawn darkness of coastal Texas had a way of playing tricks on tired eyes, especially at 5 in the morning when the only company was endless fields of drought-killed grass and the occasional oil derrick creaking in the distance. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus on the road ahead. 3 more hours until my shift at the refinery. The early morning commute was brutal, but the hazard pay made it worth it, usually. Then it happened again. A brilliant azure pulse lit up the world around me, turning everything an otherworldly shade of electric blue. It wasn't lightning. I'd seen plenty of storms roll in from the Gulf to know the difference. This was something else, something wrong. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as I pulled over, more out of instinct than conscious thought. The radio had gone silent, though I couldn't remember if I'd been listening to anything before. Just static now, a soft hiss that somehow made the silence feel heavier. I reached for my phone to check if anyone else had reported the phenomenon. No signal. Of course, out here in the coastal plains between Corpus Christi and Houston, coverage was spotty at best. I was about to start driving again when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My car's dashboard was dark. Complete electrical failure. "Come on, not now," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. The morning air suddenly felt much colder than the mild May weather should allow. That's when I saw it in my rear view mirror. A faint blue glow on the horizon, like dawn breaking 6 hours too early. But this wasn't the sun. This light pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, growing steadily brighter with each beat. I stepped out of my car, against my better judgment. The air felt wrong, charged like the moment before a lightning strike, but without the ozone smell of an approaching storm. Instead, there was a metallic taste on my tongue, copper bright and artificial. The light was definitely getting closer, or maybe spreading was a better word for it. It moved like fog rolling in from the Gulf, but fog doesn't glow like that. Fog doesn't make your skin crawl or your teeth ache. I fumbled with my phone again, trying to capture video of whatever this was. The screen wouldn't turn on. My watch had stopped too, the digital display frozen at 5:13 a.m. Everything electronic within sight was dead. Even the distant warning lights on the radio towers that usually blinked their red eyes through the darkness. A low hum started building, just at the edge of hearing. It reminded me of the sound the refinery's generators made during startup, but deeper. Wrong somehow. The vibration of it rattled in my chest cavity, making my heart feel like it was beating out of sync. The blue light had spread across half the sky now, and I could see things moving within it. Not shadows exactly, more like the shapes you see when you press your fingers against your closed eyes. Geometric patterns that shouldn't exist in nature, folding and unfolding in impossible ways. I should have run, should have started walking at least, but I couldn't look away. The patterns were mesmerizing, and each pulse of light seemed to reach directly into my brain, making thoughts slip away like water through cupped hands. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just the absence of my car's engine or the radio's static, but everything. No birds, no insects, no wind in the grass. The world held its breath, and in that perfect stillness, I heard it. Footsteps in the field beside the highway. I turned, slowly, fighting against the strange lethargy that had settled into my muscles. The blue light cast everything in sharp relief, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. About 50 yards away, something was walking through the dead grass. It moved like a person, mostly, but people don't fold themselves that way when they walk. People's joints don't bend backward, then forward, then sideways with each step. People don't leave patches of frost on sun-baked Texas soil in the middle of May. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The humming had grown louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the sky anymore. It was coming from inside my head. My ears popped, and suddenly I could hear voices in the hum, thousands of them, all speaking at once in languages that human vocal cords couldn't possibly produce. The thing in the field stopped, turned. I couldn't see a face, but I felt it looking at me. The blue light pulsed once more, and in that flash, I saw others. Dozens of them, scattered across the field, all standing perfectly still, all facing me. My legs finally remembered how to move. I ran, leaving my dead car behind. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, every shadow now a potential horror. The humming followed, growing louder with each step, until it felt like my skull would crack from the pressure. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stop making sense. The blue light would fade, then flare again, and with each pulse, the things in the field were closer. They never seemed to move when I was looking directly at them, but every time I turned around, the distance had shrunk. Finally, mercifully, I saw headlights approaching, a truck moving fast. I waved my arms frantically, standing in the middle of the road. The truck slowed, then stopped. An old man leaned out the window, looking concerned. "You all right there, son? Ain't safe to be out here this time of morning." I tried to explain, pointing behind me, but the words wouldn't come out right. The blue light was gone, the humming had stopped, the field was empty except for the dead grass swaying in a wind I still couldn't feel. The old man gave me a ride to the nearest gas station. I called in sick to work, then called a tow truck for my car. When they brought it in later that day, everything electrical worked perfectly. No explanation for why it had died. I searched local news, social media, everything I could think of. Nobody reported seeing anything unusual that morning. No power outages, no atmospheric phenomena, nothing. I even called the nearby Air Force Base, but they just took my name and number and never called back. I still drive that route to work. Had to, jobs aren't easy to come by these days. But I leave an hour earlier now, so I never have to drive it at 5:13 a.m. And I keep my eyes straight ahead, never looking at the fields beside the road. Because sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I catch glimpses of blue light. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my car, I start to hear that humming again. The worst part? Last week I noticed frost on my windows. Inside the car, in the middle of a Texas summer, and when I looked closer, I saw patterns in the frost, geometric shapes, folding and unfolding, just like the ones I saw in that light. They're watching, waiting, and I know, deep in my bones, that they're not done with me yet. I thought about reporting it again, trying to find someone who would believe me. But yesterday morning, I found a note on my windshield. No words, just patterns drawn in frost that hadn't melted in the morning sun. Patterns that hurt my eyes to look at, that made that copper taste flood my mouth again. So, I drive, and I watch the sky, and I pray I never find out what they really want. Because I have a feeling that when they finally decide to show themselves again, it won't just be one person on a dark highway who sees them. And next time, they might not be content just to watch. Redditor 8. I never believed my mother's story about that night in 1983. Not really. But now, 42 years later, as I sit in my childhood bedroom with the curtains drawn tight, I understand why her hands would shake whenever she talked about it, why she insisted on taking the laundry in before sunset, even on the hottest summer days when the clothes could use a few more hours to dry. The washing machine churns downstairs, its familiar rhythm doing little to settle my nerves. I've been staying here since Mom's funeral 3 weeks ago, sorting through her belongings and trying to decide what to do with the house. That's when I found her journals, hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet. The pages where she wrote about that night are worn thin from repeated handling, the ink smeared in places where her tears had fallen. I remember how she used to tell it. She was getting the washing off the line after 9, the summer air still warm against her skin. 3 houses down, maybe 30 feet up, she saw it. An oval-shaped craft, silent as death, with windows that pulsed from red to green. She ran inside and hid, and when she worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. That was the sanitized version, the one she told at family gatherings when someone brought up UFOs or conspiracy theories. But her journal tells a different story, and now I'm seeing the same lights she described, hovering just beyond my window. It started 2 nights ago. I was folding a stack of Mom's old sweaters when the bedroom grew cold. Not the gradual chill of a summer night, but an immediate, bone-deep cold that made my teeth ache. The digital clock on the nightstand flickered. 9:47 p.m., the same time Mom wrote about in her journal. I looked out the window and saw nothing at first, just the familiar row of suburban houses, their windows warm with artificial light. Then something moved in my peripheral vision, a shadow darker than the night sky. When I turned my head, I caught a glimpse of it, an oval shape, exactly where Mom said it had been, with lights that shifted from crimson to emerald in a hypnotic rhythm. My first instinct was to run, just like she had, but as I turned away, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice, so clear it could have been coming from inside my own head. "We've been waiting for you to find the journals, Anna. My name. They knew my name." I dove under the covers like a frightened child, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally emerged, hours later, the room was warm again. But there was something new on Mom's dresser, a small metallic disc about the size of a quarter, pulsing with the same red-green pattern I'd seen in the sky. The next day I told myself it was grief playing tricks on my mind. I'd been alone in this house too long, surrounded by Mom's things, marinating in old memories. I put the disc in my pocket, intending to examine it in the daylight, but when I reached for it later, it was gone. That night they came back. This time, I was in the kitchen, making tea to help me sleep. The lights flickered first. Not just a flicker, but a complete power failure that plunged the house into darkness. In that instant of blackness, I heard something scraping against the back door. Not the sound of branches in the wind, but deliberate, like metal on metal. The power returned, but the kitchen lights had changed. They pulsed now, red, green, red, green. Through the window above the sink, I could see the craft, closer this time. Close enough to make out details Mom had never mentioned. The way its surface seemed to ripple like mercury. The faint humming that wasn't quite a sound, but more a vibration in my bones. "We knew her well, your mother," the voice came again, and this time I couldn't pretend it was in my head. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "She was special, like you." I ran upstairs, locked myself in the bedroom, and that's where I've been for the past 6 hours. But they're still out there. I can feel them waiting. Mom's journal sits open on my lap, and I'm reading the parts she never told anyone about. How they visited her regularly after that first night. How they showed her things. Impossible things. About the universe. About time. About the thin membrane between what we think is real and what actually exists. How they taught her to do things that defied the laws of physics. The next page is blank except for a single sentence. They said they'd come back for Anna. My hands shake as I write this, trying to document everything before... Before what? The lights are getting brighter now, and I can hear that not quite sound growing stronger. The air feels thick, like honey, and gravity seems to be shifting. Objects on Mom's dresser are starting to float. I understand now why she kept so many secrets. Why she'd sometimes stare into space with that faraway look, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that left brief trails of light. Why, in her final days, she kept insisting that she wasn't really dying, just transitioning. The bedroom door is opening, but I'm not afraid anymore. The voice is clearer now, and I recognize it, not as something alien, but as a chorus of familiar tones. Mom's voice is in there, woven together with others, speaking in harmonies that human vocal cords could never produce. It's time, Anna. Your mother's waiting. The lights are everywhere now. Red, green, red, green. The journal falls from my lap, floating upward like a leaf caught in an invisible breeze. I can see my hand becoming translucent, luminous, as I reach toward the doorway, toward the figures that stand there, glowing with their own inner light. Mom never told me the whole truth about that night in 1983, but she left me all the clues I'd need. She knew that when they came back for me, I'd be ready. And I am. I wish I'd believed her sooner. The last thing I see as my body dissolves into light is the old laundry line through the window, shirts and sheets swaying in a wind that isn't there. Then everything shifts, and I understand that this isn't an ending at all. It's an inheritance. Redditor 9. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Even my husband doesn't know everything. How could he? He slept through the beginning, through those crucial first moments when the world as I knew it began to unravel. Sometimes I wonder if I should wake him up when the memories keep me tossing and turning, but then I remember the look in their eyes, and I know it's better to let him rest in ignorance. It was late July last year, one of those sticky summer nights where the sheets cling to your skin no matter how many times you kick them off. The window AC unit had been making this irregular thumping sound all night, like a heart beating out of rhythm. Jack had fallen asleep hours ago. He could sleep through anything, but I kept cycling through social media on my phone, watching the clock tick closer to 3 a.m. The screen's blue light was starting to give me a headache, so I finally set it face down on the nightstand. That's when I noticed something odd about the shadows on our bedroom ceiling. They seemed to be moving. Not the usual play of headlights from passing cars. We lived on a quiet suburban street where traffic died down by midnight. This was different. A soft, pulsing glow, like someone had filled a balloon with blue lightning. I rolled over toward the window, my heart already picking up speed. The curtains were partially open. I always left them that way, hoping the morning sun would help me wake up for work. But what I saw through that gap wasn't the sun. It wasn't anything I could explain. Hovering above the rooftops of our neighborhood was an oval-shaped object, glowing with an electric blue light that seemed to ripple and flow across its surface. It moved with impossible grace, too slow to be a meteor, but too fast and smooth to be any kind of conventional aircraft. Behind it stretched a luminescent trail, like a cosmic fingerprint, drawn across the night sky. My first instinct was to grab my phone, to document what I was seeing, but my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't even unlock the screen. The object was roughly the size of a small house, and it moved in complete silence. No engine noise, no wind disturbance, nothing. Just that otherworldly blue glow casting strange shadows through every window it passed. In the distance, I could hear dogs starting to bark, a wave of canine anxiety spreading through the neighborhood as the object passed overhead. Then came the voices, other witnesses I assumed, calling out to each other in the street. I should have woken Jack then, should have shared this moment with him. Instead, I slipped out of bed, pulled on my robe, and headed for the front door. The summer night air hit me like a warm, wet blanket as I stepped onto our porch. The object was already disappearing behind the Morrisons' house at the end of the street, but I could still see that haunting blue trail hanging in the air like a ghost. A few of our neighbors were outside in their pajamas, pointing and talking in hushed, excited voices. Mrs. Chen from across the street caught my eye and waved, her face lit with wonder. That should have been the end of it. A strange but exciting glimpse of something unexplainable, a story to tell at parties, maybe even a letter to the local news. But as I stood there on the porch, the hairs on the back of my neck began to rise. The excited voices of my neighbors had gone quiet, too quiet. The dogs had stopped barking. Even the crickets had fallen silent. Then the blue light returned, brighter this time, flooding the street with its unnatural glow. But it wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from behind me, from inside my house. I turned around slowly, my bare feet frozen to the concrete porch. Through our front window, I could see that same pulsing light filling our living room. My shadow stretched long and dark across the lawn, and as I watched, a second shadow joined it. A shape that shouldn't exist, all wrong angles and impossible proportions. I wanted to run, but where? Inside was unthinkable, but the street suddenly seemed very far away and very dark beyond the reach of that blue light. My neighbors had vanished, leaving their front doors hanging open like hungry mouths. Even Mrs. Chen's house was dark and still, though I could have sworn she'd been standing there just moments ago. A high-pitched hum began to fill the air, starting just at the edge of hearing but quickly building to an intense pressure inside my skull. The light from inside the house grew brighter, and my shadow companion seemed to twist and stretch, reaching toward me with limbs that moved like liquid. That's when I heard Jack's voice calling from our bedroom. "Honey, where are you?" It sounded like him, almost exactly like him, but there was something wrong with the cadence, like someone reading from a script they'd just learned. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm coming back to bed," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just needed some air." "Come inside," Not Quite Jack called back. "You need to see this. It's beautiful." The blue light pulsed again, and I caught a glimpse of something moving past the window, a tall, fluid shape that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on it. The humming in my head grew louder, and with it came a pressure, like someone, or something, trying to press thoughts into my brain that didn't belong there. I ran. I ran past the empty houses with their open doors, past the abandoned cars with their headlights suddenly blinking to life, casting more twisted shadows across the pavement. The humming followed me, along with Jack's voice, calling my name, over and over, each repetition sounding less and less human. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, finally collapsing behind the old Peterson garage 3 blocks away. The blue light still pulsed in the distance, but it seemed weaker here, more diffuse. The humming in my head had faded to a dull throb. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched in the darkness, listening to the sound of footsteps that never quite matched any human walking pattern. Eventually, the night grew quiet again. The crickets returned first, then a distant dog bark. When I finally gathered the courage to peek around the garage, the blue light was gone. I walked home as the sky began to lighten, my bare feet dirty and scraped. Our front door was closed, though I knew I'd left it open when I fled. Inside, everything looked normal. No sign of the blue light, no strange shadows, no impossible shapes. Jack was still asleep in our bed, exactly as I'd left him. When he woke up, he had no memory of calling out to me. In fact, he said he'd slept through the night without stirring once. The news reported a few scattered UFO sightings in the area, but nothing about the light that had filled our house, or the voices, or the shadows that moved wrong. But something changed that night. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I notice the shadows on our ceiling moving in ways they shouldn't. The AC unit still makes that irregular thumping sound, but now it almost seems like a pattern, like something trying to communicate. And Jack, sometimes he pauses too long before responding to a question or moves in a way that seems just slightly off, like someone doing their best impression of human behavior. The blue light hasn't returned, at least not that I've seen. But every night around 3 a.m., the dogs in our neighborhood start barking all at once, and I swear I can feel that pressure in my head again, like something trying to push its way in. And sometimes, in the morning, I find our front door standing open, though I know I locked it the night before. I keep telling myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by late-night anxiety and too much screen time. But then I catch a glimpse of my shadow on the wall, and for just a moment, it doesn't move quite right. And I wonder, did I really escape that night? Or did something follow me home, something that's still waiting, watching, learning how to wear our shapes and speak with our voices? I haven't told Jack any of this. How could I? He sleeps so peacefully now, never stirring, not even when the blue light sometimes flickers behind his eyelids.